Alright guys, so here we go. Today in this video we're going to go through epoxy stuffing the reed area on these 62T cases. So I have done another video on case porting which will be linked, I don't know, somewhere over here or up here. So that video shows you how to port them. This is just stuffing them. So let's get started and I will explain what we're doing. Alright guys, so there's several things that we do with these Yamaha cases. So one of them is we port them, so where we'll finger port over here to allow it to flow into the cylinder easier, help airflow and performance. We fill all up here with epoxy, this front area with epoxy, which that's because we end up breaking through these passages. So we do that, which is in the video I was talking about before. The last thing we do is we stuff the reed area. So 2 strokes, there's case volume. So it's tricky because you need volume for flow, but too much volume will actually hurt you. So if you can stuff certain areas of the cases to take up some of the volume, it actually increases the pressure when the piston comes down and helps performance. So what we're going to do in this video, and I'll walk you through it, we're going to end up texturing all this surface. We're going to cut grooves for the epoxy so that this can't pop out. And we will end up filling this all with epoxy, angling it to help the reeds, and then finishing it all off. So the first part of this video, all we're going to be doing is grinding a texture in here for the epoxy to hold on to. We're also going to put grooves so the epoxy can't pop out if for some reason something did go wrong. And then we'll show you the rest. So let's get started. Now, if you see when I'm doing this, as I'm going in here, I'm actually growing straight in, which is creating a groove for this not to pop out. Now, I don't go all the way through, and I leave it. So basically, all this texture we're doing right now is just to give the epoxy something to grip onto. Epoxy done right doesn't come out. The only way it ends up coming out is if somebody, one, goes to powder coat cases, which if you have epoxy cases, don't powder coat them. First thing. If you want powder coated cases, which I don't recommend to begin with, do it before you do all this work or you're going to have issues. What ends up happening is when you go to powder coat it, you have to heat the cases up. The aluminum expands more than the epoxy does and it separates all the bonds. So as long as the thing's not overheated to the point where, you know, it is literally 300 degrees and you melted everything, you know, epoxy really doesn't come off when it's done right. So we're going to texture everything like I said. We're then going to clean it all with acetone, let it dry, and then we'll put the epoxy. So there's a couple different epoxies you can use for this. You can use JB Weld or DevCon. Both work great. I've run both for years. You know, I have some cases that we did 16, 17 years ago that the epoxy is still in and intact. I really haven't seen a difference between the two products. For the ramps, though, we're going to use, it's called Splash Zone. Grab it. Just to show you guys. So this is what we're going to end up using. It's a 2-part compound, an A and a B. So we mix it together. It's like a putty. And then we basically smush it in and get the angle. And then I'll show you how we grind it to the angle that we need. So really what we're doing here is we're putting an epoxy ramp here, which gives less air around the reed valves. So there's less to compress. Also, you're taking up the dead space. So increasing the internal compression inside the 2-stroke, which really helps, you know, fill the cylinder at bottom dead center. So let me get the other side done and then we'll get cleaning. Now, if you can see, we textured all the areas that the epoxy is going to be. All that is doing is we're giving it not only a chemical bond, we're giving it a mechanical bond. So that epoxy is going to go into all these little cuts, and that helps hold it in. So what I'm going to do, first, I am going to fill all up here and do the rest of the porting on this, and then when we restart this video, or when I start back up, I will show you us filling this area with epoxy. So when I do these cases, I do all the prep work first. This will all be epoxy filled first. I will port there, finger port it, and then do these ramps last. The main reason is epoxy is by far the softest. So when I'm porting over here, you know, I can nick this epoxy, and I don't want to do that. So just explaining, not saying my way is the right way, but that's the way I do it. Alrighty, we'll be back. Alright, so all the surface prep is done. As you can see, I cut grooves into the front of each finger on all of them. There's texture on everything, and there's texture everywhere where the epoxy is going to go up. You can see this is finger ported already. This one, I'm not going to show everything because this is for a sponsored rider's motor. There's a couple things that are done differently on the inside to allow airflow. But these aren't finished ported yet either. So as I was saying, what I'll do when I do ramps like this, I will rough port everything. After it's rough ported, then I will do the epoxy work. Then I will finish porting it. And then we deck the top, you know, for all this extra epoxy, which then gives a better gasket surface up here, so on and so forth. And these grooves in the fingers, so there's grooves there. Let me see. I don't know if you can tell. There's actually a barrel cut underneath each one of these ports in these fingers so that, one, it can't pop up. It's a mechanical, you know, the way it's cut, even if it's separated, it couldn't pop up. And then with these cut like that, even if it popped up, it would only be able to pop up and move forward. And it wouldn't be able to move forward enough because it would hit the reed to pop out. So you'd never have it, in theory, go into the engine. I've never had one pop out. I've always kind of gone overboard on texturing and grinding grooves into things. with composites and epoxy, you want to have both a chemical, so this bonding into the pores, and also mechanical, where there's grooves for this to glue into and grab, which makes it less likely for it to come out. So what we're going to do on these, as I said, I use Splash Zone. This stuff is like a thick putty. So I'm going to put gloves on in a second. We're going to mix it up. I'll show you how I push it in, then we let it dry, and then I use an air file to flatten it, which I'll also show you. So give me a second. Let me get the epoxy set up, and we'll go from there. All right. Let's see if I can do this in this area. One thing, gloves. So there's a bunch of different epoxies you can use for this. This is what I've used. I've used a bunch of different things over the years. So we've used DevCon, awesome stuff. Used JB Weld, never had an issue. Still use JB Weld for a lot of things, just not here. We have used DevCon putty as well as DevCon paste, and I've actually started using this stuff, I want to say 5 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that, and I got to using it more from 4-stroke porting, ironically. For filling cylinder heads and stuff like that. And then I just kind of liked how well this stuff worked and brought it over to 2-stroke. I know a lot of people that have used it for 2-stroke for a long time with great success. So here's basically what you do. You get even amounts out. Clean this. So never take the one and put it in the other, or you're going to start hardening the other one, of course. So just clean this off first. That one's clean. We'll go to the other. It's pretty close. Wish there was smell-o-vision at the moment because this stuff stinks. So we're basically just going to go for a constant color. You can also put it in your hands if you like and mix it that way. I have just found this way is better. Easier to get it mixed. Cases for a second. It kind of turns this like greenish color, which I'll show you when it's all done, when it's mixed right. So onto materials, how I was saying, there's nothing wrong with using JB Weld. There's nothing wrong with using DevCon. We've used both at different times. DevCon, personally, I think it's great. The only thing is, the cost-wise, it's so much more expensive than everything else. You know, when you're doing as many engines as we're doing, if there's not an actual performance benefit to it, what's the purpose of spending the extra money? You know, when you're doing, you know, 1 or 2 for yourself, it doesn't really matter. You know, when you're doing, you know, 50 motors a month, something like that, it adds up quickly, especially when there's really not a benefit. You know, we have engines that I did with JB Weld, you know, almost 20 years ago, and the JB Weld's still holding. We have engines with DevCon that we did in that same time frame that are still holding, so it's not like one of them super outperforms the other. So now, I don't know if you can see in here, but now it's that green color, which that's the color we're looking for. Another thing with this stuff, don't forget your screwdriver. You know, when you're done laying all this epoxy, make sure to go back and clean it off with acetone quickly, or even hit it with a torch, or you're not going to have a usable screwdriver anymore. So what I will do, I'll break it into a half, and then, let's see, can we see here? And it's basically like putty. So we're going to put it in, we're going to push it into all the trenches. Now, depending on the reeds you're using, will change the ramp angle. I'm not going to go super into detail on ramp angle and stuff like that, but the ramp angle has to be, so if your reed valve is like this, your ramp angle can't be more, or you're trapping air in this pocket. So it needs to be less than your reed angle. And now, like a V-Force, which is using 2 different sets of pedals per cage, has not as steep of an angle as like a Boysen rad valve or something like that. Another thing to take into consideration when you're doing this, which I machine them at the end, but at the front, this front little lip, if you fill this all the way and you're using a standard reed cage configuration, the reeds are going to hit the epoxy there. So you either need to use a reed spacer or use like a Boysen high velocity intake manifold, something like that, that actually spaces the reeds into the intake manifold to get it away. And by doing that, you don't end up hitting the reed cage for it. So just pay attention when you're doing this epoxy work. If it's your first time, leave, you know, 3/8 of an inch in the front of here, or grind it away after you're done. Or, you know, after you're done porting it, mount your intake manifold and see how you have to grind accordingly for it not to hit, so that I'm not telling you how to do something and then you assemble the whole engine and go, oh no, this doesn't fit, this is terrible. Make sure you take that step, or you're going to hate life when this is all together and you have to trench out a groove. All right. So now this ramp I do by eye first, and then when I'm done I will actually check it with an angle gauge. The main thing is that they're even. Now, then what I do is I come in here and I just make sure everything's pushed in nicely. This is all going to be ground away at the end, of course. But by pushing all this in nicely like that, you know that it bonds well to the case, and you're not going to have any issues with separating. Now, another trick that I do, which I'll show you, is what I'll do now to make sure I can set these, you know, because it is epoxy, it can sag when we're done. You know, I'm pushing this back up, and then we want to push it back down. If we do that, it'll sag back. So all I do is I take some duct tape, and this is just to hold the epoxy so that when I work from the other side in a second, it doesn't really droop back. And you get a really nice finish. You got to remember, all this is still going to get ported when we're done, but this kind of gives it a solid surface to hold on to. Go. So now, let's see if I can. If you look in, now that I pushed it, you can see it's not quite there. So now I will go and we will just carefully. Now, as it starts to tack up, which is what it's starting to do now, you can take your gloves off, because gloves are a catch-22. You know, I'm married and I have kids, so looking like a grease ball all the time isn't always the best. But there's certain times that, unfortunately, gloves do make things more difficult. So, you know, where when you push down with a latex glove each time, it sticks to the glove and pulls up in a larger area. So sometimes getting dirty is the best way. So there we go. So now, as you can see, we just are using that duct tape to give a ramp to push it to. Now, most of this is going to be ground back down. You know, we always go too much, but as you can see, so this one, you know, you can see I had a little more, but this is going to get taken out when we grind it, as you'll see it in a little bit. So let's let that harden up, and then we will go from there. And then let me just, I like all this to be even though we're going to machine it later, because if it's all even and there's no blotches or funny things, then when we grind it in the end, it looks perfect. So it's hard to see, but that is a pretty straight ramp. This is a pretty straight ramp. It goes up because I'm just pushing the excess. You know, I could take a razor blade and cut it, but we'll just use a grinder and do that shortly. Let's let this harden up. We'll be back in a minute. All right, so put on some safety glasses, clean them. So I use this. It's what I've found has worked best. I've also, over the years, this has changed a bunch over the years from what I've done. So I used to use an airfile. This does work. It just takes forever, which is why I no longer do it. You can use a burr. The whole problem is getting a nice smooth flat area with a burr is tricky. So I've gone to this and it works really, really well. So now you can see we just roughed this in. We're not finishing anything yet. Now we're going to go in and flatten all this out. This way so it's easier to see. Can we see there? There we go. Starting to get somewhere. So, as you can see, it's starting to get cleaned up. A little bit more, we'll be good to go. Go. I don't know if you can see. There we go. So there's a nice ramp. Going in. Nice and smooth. Here's the other one. So there's a little dimple here. So, but this is going to get cut anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And there's this ramp. So, but that shows you how I straighten the ramps out. Let me show you. I'll do this little cut here and finish porting, and we'll be back in a minute. So here we go, showing one thing. So we ground it. I found a couple low spots that I just wasn't happy with. So what I ended up doing is I mixed a little more splash zone. So there was a low spot here and here, and then it was a little low here for my liking. So I just lightly pushed it in. A very thin extra coat. As you can see, there's like almost nothing on it. So now when that hardens, we will run the rotary file again, or the little belt sander, whatever you want to call it, and finish her up. So when this is dry, we'll go back to it. Be back in a sec. Alright guys, so here we go. We're all done. So you saw me sand them. I added a little more just to make them perfectly flat. And then on top of that, I put it in the mill. You could do this with a burr too if you don't have a mill. And I cut that groove in the front, which helps clear the reeds. Now depending on the reeds you're using in the intake, some intakes you don't need that. Some of them you can also fill these voids if the reeds sit into the intake, but that one's your choice. I try to stuff as much as I can, especially for these bottom end engines. So, but you can see the ramp, how it's done. It goes right into the finger port, which you can see going up. Same over here. So that's basically how you do it. So you can do this with many other tools. You can do it with a file, stuff like that. So this is just the way I do it. And then you can see the inside right there. So that's it. Like always, guys, thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, and have a great day.